The next person we're looking at for knowing the unknowable God is Friedrich Schleiermacher, and there will be a quiz at the end on how to spell that. As you may know, German words are often, in fact almost always, based on the craft or the work that especially the man did. And so Schleier in German is veil, and Macher is a maker. So his name means a maker of veils. My favorite one, there was this very hardcore New Testament scholar that lived not long ago named Ernst Käsemann. And I thought, oh, Ernst Käsemann, that's just such such an intimidating name until I learned that it was Cheese Man. It just ruined it, right? Smoke Buddha Man. Anyway, so Schleiermacher, it's a very long word, but and it has a really nice ring to it. Friedrich Schleiermacher is the person we're looking at today, and as I wrote in the little blurb, pardon me, in Headlines and Happenings, he has been called, and I think rightly so, the father of modern theology. And he's the father of modern theology across the board in the West. Roman Catholic theologians were and are profoundly influenced by him. Everyone becomes, if you're influential, everyone's going to criticize you. So he's also been criticized. Karl Barth in particular, whom we'll look at in 2 weeks, was very critical of him. But he was widely influential, and he really does start the beginning of what could be called modern theology. So the way he frames the issue of how we know the unknowable God is going to be a decisive transition in the Christian tradition, till today, actually. It's also important to realize that Schleiermacher lived in a time of tremendous criticism. And this was going on at the time of Nicholas Ludwig Count von Zinzendorf as well. It's most widely known in the two movements of rationalism and the Enlightenment. And rationalism started with René Descartes, in which you want to think only those ideas that are clear and distinct to reason, and that would then get rid of a lot of unclear and indistinct ideas that we believe based on tradition. And so the idea was that you could clear up a lot of theological mischief by using reason, right? So thinking through rationally what the church or the synagogue teach and making judgments accordingly and trying to bring church and synagogue teaching more and more into accord with reason was a very strong push in this period, especially because of the religious conflict that the Reformation had set in place. I mean, especially culminating with the 30 Years' War. If you think religious violence is a problem in our day, you got nothing on the wars of religion in Europe. I mean, it was just unbelievable. 1/5 of the population of Europe is killed during the wars of the 30 Years' War just over this issue of religious identity, and at the end of the war, very little has changed, so that was in the 1600s. But so the idea was reason can bring us to a more universal, peaceful understanding of reality and truth. And you also then have at the same time what comes to be called historical criticism of the New Testament. And so scholars will begin looking at the New Testament from the point of view of reason and start finding all sorts of contradictions in it that raise questions about its veracity, right? So, for instance, there's not one detail of the resurrection narratives that you can harmonize between Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Paul, right? So no, I don't think there's one. Actually, I could be wrong, but it's very hard to get a coherent picture of the resurrection out of the New Testament. That doesn't mean it's false, but it means that a lot of people started to criticize this. In terms of Schleiermacher, one of the most important developments of the day was the rise of modern physics. And I don't know if you saw the news that just came out at the end of last week, but we have now gotten a picture of the event horizon around the black hole at the center of the Milky Way. I mean, just an astonishing thing. But that movement toward the understanding of the universe by means of physics as a science starts with Isaac Newton in particular. And the principle of Isaac Newton, and this is very important for Schleiermacher, the principle that Isaac Newton used to try to understand the universe was for every natural effect, you must look for the same natural cause, right? So for every natural effect, you look for the same natural cause. For instance, how do you find a black hole that can't emit light? Well, you look for the cause, the black hole will cause an event horizon around it as it's eating up the stars in the area, right? And apparently the black hole at the center of the Milky Way is on a starvation diet, so it's not eating a lot. So there would be an effect of this cause, right? The black hole is a cause, the effect would be the event horizon, they found it, right? So that's Newton. But you don't look for a supernatural cause of a natural effect, right? So you're not going to say, oh, there's a black hole there, God is causing that, right? That's an act of God, directly an act of God in the universe. No, you look for a natural cause of a natural effect. We use that language in insurance. It was an act of God, but it means it was a random event for which no one is directly responsible. It doesn't mean that it had a supernatural cause. So this is going to be, pardon me, I don't know what happens to my voice in the morning, but anyway, this is going to be a really important principle for Schleiermacher. How do you describe Christian faith without any direct intervention of God into the world? Right? How do you describe Christian faith and religious life in general without any intervention of God in natural cause and effect? Right? In other words, you have to think of the universe as a closed system in which all of this has to make sense. So that's a really important aspect of Schleiermacher's theology, and it's still a major question in theology today. Faith and science work is very much involved in trying to understand how you can believe in God and the activity of God if God is not an agent in the world the way we might think of him. Yeah, I mean that would be the other thing that goes out the window is miracle, right? Although he did believe that there were things that happen in the world for which there could not be a ready natural explanation, but that you had to understand it as operating within the closed universe, right? So it wasn't a direct divine intervention in the world. And David Hume wrote this very famous essay on the human understanding in which one of the chapters was on miracles, and he just does this incredible job on miracles saying that, you know, it's the most absurd thing you could ever believe, basically. So there's this, that's another thing that's under severe criticism. And so the question became, you know, does it make any sense at all to be a believer, given all of this criticism? None of this has gone away, by the way. Most of it's gotten worse. But Schleiermacher was one of the first to try to respond to this directly. The other thing that he's responding to, though, is the elevated role that philosophy comes to have in Christianity. Because the philosophers said, well, you know, all these criticisms are valid, like the New Testament may have its problems, miracles have their problems, the world is a closed system of cause and effect, etc. But we can demonstrate the truth that Christianity is trying to teach on the basis of reason. And the two major figures who did this, who said they could do this, were Immanuel Kant on the one hand and Hegel on the other. And it's interesting just to keep them in mind because Kant justifies Christianity by means of practical reason. It's a form of doing, it's mainly morality. And Hegel justifies Christian teaching on the basis of thinking, that Christianity is about thinking spirit. And its symbols need to be formulated in terms of concepts so that you can demonstrate their rationality. And so Hegel took the doctrine of the Trinity and turned it into the concept of spirit and then demonstrated that it was the truth of all reality. That the Trinity is the truth of all reality. That's a pretty amazing concept, but it's not the truth of all reality in the way that Christianity formulates it. That's a picture. You have to turn it into a concept. So you have one philosopher saying, I can demonstrate the rational truth of Christian teaching philosophically in terms of thinking, and another thinker, Immanuel Kant, saying, I can demonstrate the truth of Christianity by means of moral reason. That religion, there's only one religion, and it's based on morality. And morality is based on the law that reason gives to itself. And every human being has reason that gives the law to itself. And therefore, morality as a religion is universal. It's in China, it's in Brazil, it's in Chile, it's in Argentina, it's wherever you go, wherever there are human beings, there's going to be the moral law, the reason is giving to itself, and that's what religion is really about. And he thinks Jesus was about that, right? That he was teaching about a form of life in which the obedience to the law is prior to everything else. He's willing to give his life for it, right? And every incentive that could go against it, he ignores. and obeys unto death, even death on the cross. And Kant says that's the truth of Christianity, and we should make all interpretation of religious truth, Christian truth, conform to that more and more over time. So those are the two major options that are rising in Schleiermacher's day that are saying, no, Christianity's true. It's just a philosophy has to justify it, right? And so just get out of the way, you theologians, get out of the way, you've done your damage, and we'll clarify the matter for you. So you can see though that you would, if you wanted to say, well, Christianity is real, we can simplify this, the teaching of Jesus, etc. You hear people say this today, it's really, Jesus is really just talking about a form of life, he's talking about, obeying the law for this, and it's like, okay, Kant's like, okay, you're my people, right? Or you can say, no, Christianity is really about the truth of doctrine that can be demonstrated rationally. Hegel's like, okay, come on, you're my people here. And Hegel now is much more influential than any period in history, I think. So he's very in vogue in terms of philosophy and theology. Very good. So the question was, what about intuition? That's where Pascal in the 17th century will go that way. That's his answer to Descartes, that there are many things we know by intuition that can't be demonstrated. For instance, geometry, what's a point, right? Demonstrate a point. You can't. You have to intuit a point. What's a straight line? Can't demonstrate that either. So intuition, that's going to be where Schleiermacher goes. That's very good. But you can see what he's trying to do, what he would try to do then is find a third way that leads to the integrity of the religious life in general. So by that I mean Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, polytheistic, tribal, family. You could even have a clan religion, etc. He wants to justify that on its own terms so that it doesn't get swallowed up by moral reason on the one hand, or because that would eliminate the distinctiveness of every tradition, right? Every tradition is just a pale approximation of a universal truth. And Schleiermacher doesn't want that. He doesn't want a universal religion. He's often misread as though he did, but he didn't. He wanted to understand how you could describe each particular tradition in a way that can't be reduced to either thinking spirit or morality, right? And then he also obviously wanted to understand the Christian tradition in that way as well. But he also wanted to do this in a way that preserved critical reason, right? So he wasn't an anti-science theologian. He thought you could actually combine a scientific spirit with a religious spirit. It's really quite remarkable. And so in order to do so, he's going to have to find a third way of thinking about religious life that doesn't lead to getting swallowed up by duty or swallowed up by thinking, if that makes sense. Now Schleiermacher himself, and there's this great quote, most of the text I had for today is me, and that's because Schleiermacher is really difficult to read. And so I thought, God, if I put a bunch of Schleiermacher quotes in there, it's just going to be like, ugh. So I thought I'd do kind of an exposition of his thought rather than quote him at great length. But the third paragraph on the first page, I think, really gets at what he's trying to do. I say the unique contribution of Schleiermacher lay in his ability to internalize the criticisms of the Christian truth claims by history, philosophy, and science, and yet still develop a foundation for human religiousness in general, and Christian faith in particular, that did not lead to the collapse of religion and faith into philosophy. Schleiermacher thought he could thereby establish, and this is his words now, an eternal covenant between living Christian faith and completely free, independent scientific inquiry, so that faith does not hinder science and science does not exclude faith, so that even as a theologian he could, quote, participate actively in the building up of both the church and science, right? So I think that's really a remarkable sentence. So he's not against science, he's not against critical reason, he's not against Newton, he's not against historical criticism, etc. In fact, the life of Jesus, that whole genre, the life of Jesus, Pope Benedict XVI wrote a book called The Life of Jesus. Schleiermacher writes the first life of Jesus, right? So he's not averse to this kind of critical thinking. But he also thinks that you can think critically about Christian faith and about religious life without eliminating it, right? So the question then is, what is it if it can't be eliminated by critical reason, if it can't be eliminated by science. And science's view of science, by the way, is the German word for that would be Wissenschaft, and it has much more to do than just with the hard sciences. In the United States, when we say science, we think of biology or physics or things like that. But he's thinking of a scientific approach to reality, where you try to become as objective as you possibly can in terms of your description of what's actually going on. And so by science, he means that you can understand religion scientifically, right? He doesn't mean biologically, he means scientifically. So I hope that's clear, but that's one of the unique contributions of him, is that he wanted this eternal covenant between free Christian piety and free scientific inquiry, and he really thought that he could pull this off together. Now, it's kind of interesting that he winds up at this position because of the way he was raised. His father was a very pious man. He was a reformed pastor in Germany. And he was initially very caught up in rationalism, and then realized the limits of rationalism, and through the influence of Zinzendorf and the Moravians, he became a pietist. And so, as you may, if you were here for Zinzendorf wants us to see the crucified Savior, the crucified Creator before the eyes of our heart, and fall in love with him, and give our lives over to him in marriage, actually. We would be wed, body and soul to him, and that's from Revelation 19. And so there's this very strong emphasis on affectivity, on feeling. You feel your distress, and then you feel the help of the Savior. It's not rational, it's not moral, it's not doctrinal, it's a matter of feeling. This is Zinzendorf. And so Schleiermacher's father was caught up in this, and he was saved from rationalism and from rational criticism by Zinzendorf and the Moravian movement. And so he wanted to spare his son, Friedrich, the same anguish of going through this critical phase. And so he educated him in Moravian schools, and the Moravians like the schools in Lititz, right? Linden Hall. The Moravians opened schools all over Germany and Europe. And so he sent his son to Moravian schools. And while he was at a Moravian school, Schleiermacher, in fact, fell in love with the crucified Savior, right? And so he believed, at this point, he believed that his Creator suffered and died for him. So Christ is his God who died for him. That's the center of Zinzendorf's piety. That's the center of Schleiermacher's young piety, right? And he says all the way through his life that they awakened the higher life in him. The Moravians did this. But Schleiermacher, like his father, had a critical spirit. And unlike his father, who began critical and then became pietist, Schleiermacher started pietist and became critical, right? And so they told him, don't read people like Immanuel Kant. And Schleiermacher's like, really? So he and his fellow students formed a little group. They'd probably go under the blanket with a flashlight at night, right? And read Kant. And so Schleiermacher went through this very severe period of criticism where everything he believed seemed to be evaporating before his eyes because of the things he was reading and studying, and also because he had that kind of mind. And he writes a letter to his father in the midst of this crisis because he knows his father's going to be horrified by what's happening to him. And this is in the second to the last paragraph. I say the effect of this reading of people like Kant and others was to bring about Schleiermacher's loss of faith in the two central doctrines of the Moravian movement. And this is what he writes to his father. Quote, I cannot believe that he who called himself the Son of Man was the true eternal God. I cannot believe that his death was a vicarious atonement. I mean, that's a torpedo at the engine room of Zinzendorf's theology, right? That your Creator has died for your sins. That's it, right? That's his whole theology. And so Schleiermacher's father is like, you're right, you've lost your faith, and I don't know what to do with you. They eventually reconciled, but they had a major falling out. Schleiermacher leaves the Moravian schools and goes to the University of Halle, which at this point was much more friendly to people with critical spirit. But interestingly, after all the dust settles of this criticism, he still believed in God, and he still believed that Jesus was his Savior. How is that possible?
Yes, how?
Right? How do you go through the acid bath of criticism in which everything seems to go out the window and come out of it believing in God as strongly as you ever did, and believing that Jesus is your Savior, even though you no longer believe that he's divine by nature, and even though you no longer believe that his death is the atoning sacrifice for sin. So that's his question, is how is that possible? So faith in God and faith in Christ must be something that can be scientifically studied, that can't be eliminated by the acid bath of criticism, right? It must be a legitimate aspect of what it means to be human. It must be an essential aspect of what it means to be human. To form religious communities around an experience of God, we'll talk about that in a minute, and also then to form distinctive communities that are different from one another, right? That are legitimately different from one another. So it's really interesting that he makes this move, and he realized that, and going to Patsy's question, what let him go through this was Zinzendorf and the Moravian emphasis that faith is feeling. Gefühl is the German word. It's more than feeling, it's more like an intuition. Faith is based on an intuition. It's not based on doctrine, and it's not based on duty. It's an intuition about reality. It can be explored rationally, and it certainly leads to certain forms of activity, but it's not knowing and it's not doing, it's what he calls feeling. But I think intuition might even be a better phrase for that. So then the quote at the very end of page 1, I think really gets at what happened. He says, "And I may say that after all that I have passed through, I have become a Herrnhuter or a Moravian only of a higher, I become a Herrnhuter again, only of a higher order." And so he never dismisses the Moravian community. He says they're the ones who awaken this higher life in him, and he's indebted to them for this insight that faith is not doctrine, and faith is not duty, faith is an intuition, faith is a feeling that God exists, is your creator, and that Jesus is your redeemer, right? So then the question becomes, how do you formulate this faith in such a way that it can withstand scientific scrutiny? How do you formulate it scientifically so that the scientists will leave us alone and say, you know what? Religious life is essential to the development of the human spirit. Religious life is essential to what it means to be human. I'm blaming Starbucks, right? Thanks, Glenn. Schleiermacher would say that science is the attempt to understand the universe by reason. He also realized that there's probably most of it we'll never understand. Actually, I just heard a talk recently that we now know, and this will probably change too, that of all that we think exists in the universe, we know 0.001%. That includes galaxies, supernovas, black holes, everything you see, feel, touch, telescopes look at and everything, 0.001%. So I don't think that would surprise Schleiermacher. So on the other hand, is it a bad thing? Is it religiously improper to try to understand the universe? No, in fact, he would say that the feelings on the basis of which religion exists are actually enhanced by the scientific study of the universe, right? And so he would not play them off against each other, but he would also not claim that you could exhaustively understand the universe rationally, but you can't stop trying. And the one thing you can't do, he thinks, now others may disagree with him, is bring God in as an explanation for things that happen in the universe. Like that happened because God intervened, right? Well, what happened when God didn't intervene? You know, you hear people say that, they were in a building, it blew up, 10 people were killed, they got out alive, and they say that's the act of God. God was there. It's like, what about the other 10 people who were dead? What was God doing there? So, that's part of the difficulty with views of divine intervention, is that it can be very particularistic and kind of nasty when you think about the people who didn't make it, Anyway, so it's a very good question, though. And the rationalists were going in that direction. God created reason. Reason is given to us so we can understand everything rationally. The New Testament makes no sense rationally. It does make sense morally. Let's go in that direction, right? So that would be a very strong argument the rationalists made, is that God is rational. God created reason. God created the universe rationally. And look at the beauty that mathematics can understand so many things, etc. But Schleiermacher would say that if that's all you have, then you've eliminated religious life. Right? Christianity in particular and religious life in general. So the question then becomes, and this is on the top of page 2, he has 2 tasks before him once he emerges out of this storm of criticism, if you will. One's task, this is quoting him now, one's task is rather, 1, to endeavor both to understand the essence of Christianity in contradistinction to other churches and other kinds of faith, and 2, to understand the nature of piety and of religious communities in relation to all other activities of the human spirit. Now, in my discussion, I reversed the order of these because I think it makes more sense to talk about the second one first. But look at that description. 1 is to understand the essence of Christianity in contradistinction to all other forms of piety or religiosity. So what makes Christianity Christianity and not Judaism, not Gnosticism, not Platonism, not something else? And then secondly, to understand the nature of piety and religious communities in relation to all other activities of the human spirit. This means that religious life is an activity of the human spirit, right? To be human is to be religious. It isn't only to be religious, but it is to, in fact, have the religious is an essential part of human development, right? And if you eliminate it from your understanding of the human being, you're eliminating a large part of what it means to be human. This would be Schleiermacher's point. It's rooted in the human spirit. It isn't coming from divine intervention into the world. It's how we are. It's how we exist and how we developed. Well, how does he then go about doing this? And we'll begin with religious communities as a whole first. Schleiermacher roots the essence of all religious communities in the structure of human consciousness. And this can be very hard to wrap our heads around. This is what's called the Copernican Revolution in theology, is that he roots religion in our minds, right, in our consciousness. He doesn't root it in transcendence directly. He roots it in us, in the way our minds work, in consciousness itself. He says that, and I love this, he says, anyone with a modicum of introspection can see that we experience ourselves as relatively dependent and relatively free. And the degrees of these things can change over time. So for instance, when you're an infant, you're massively dependent, but you're still independent. I was on a flight from San Juan to Philadelphia. There was a young infant in the lap of a woman across the aisle who exercised a tremendous amount of relative independence, especially vocally, right? And I just sit there and I go, we were all there, and those of us who were parents had this meltdown in the middle of a flight, and everyone's staring at you. But that, even an infant who is incredibly dependent on the parents is independent. And then the older you get, obviously, the more independence you have, but then you're still dependent. We're all dependent on one another. But we're also independent of one another. We also have freedom from one another. But it's a relative freedom, and it's a relative dependence. It's not an absolute freedom, and it's not an absolute dependence on anything in the universe, including the universe as a whole. I love people who write these things on Facebook. The universe wanted me to celebrate my birthday today. Well, isn't that nice? So glad the universe had that thought for you. But anyway, so you're not absolutely dependent even on the universe as a whole. Because we exercise, even though we're dependent, we're massively dependent on the universe as we now know, but we're also independent of it, right? We exert an influence on it, and actually we influence the world, and that's a real problem right now, because the influences we have can be really problematic. So we have this dialectic, if you will, of relative freedom and relative dependence. We also, and this becomes a very controversial claim because he just claims it, he also claims that every human being, if they just have a little modicum of introspection again, realizes that we can't be absolutely free, because if we were absolutely free, we would know ourselves as the source both of our freedom and of the universe in which we act. So if we were absolutely free, we would be the creator, basically. And we know we're not the creator, right? Well, so what is the case? Well, we have this immediate self-consciousness of absolute dependence. This is his claim. It's an immediate self-consciousness of absolute dependence. It's not a mediated consciousness, because if it were mediate, it would be part of that relative freedom, relative dependence. So it's not mediated by anything. It's immediate in that, and this is the most interesting part, this consciousness transcends subject-object, right? So you're no longer in this form of consciousness. You are not conscious of yourself as a self independent of anything, right? You have an immediate consciousness of absolute dependence. Hegel thought this was nonsense, by the way. There's nothing immediate. There's no immediate consciousness. And other theologians were very critical of Schleiermacher. They called it mysticism, right? It is. Actually, the mystics talk about this all the time, an immediate self-consciousness in which you lose the consciousness of yourself in distinction from the reality you're experiencing, right? So every human being has this, an immediate self-consciousness of absolute dependence, right? And that's then at the core of all religious life, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, on and on. That's at the core. But, and this is where he's very badly understood, or misunderstood, this consciousness never emerges on its own. It can't emerge on its own. We never have the direct intuition of this God consciousness on its own. Right? It always emerges in combination with what he calls our sensible self-consciousness. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's important to then go back and say, so what is this consciousness itself, this immediate consciousness of absolute dependence? He would say that this becomes a revelation of God when the concept of God is added to it. Right? So when the immediate consciousness of absolute dependence gives rise to the concept God, that's the revelation of God. So what is God? What is the referent of the word God for Schleiermacher? It is that upon which I have an immediate consciousness of absolute dependence. Right? That I and the universe are absolutely dependent on the one of which I'm immediately conscious of being absolutely dependent. Right, so we are the way that the universe becomes conscious of its absolute dependence on its creator. Right, it's pretty interesting, actually, to think about it that way. And so, so in that third paragraph on the second page, and this is, you can see from the writing that this is why I didn't include a whole lot of quotes from Schleiermacher, because he's very tough to understand. But he says, the feeling of absolute dependence becomes a clear, and you can see their feeling, right? It's a feeling of absolute dependence, becomes a clear self-consciousness only as this idea of God comes simultaneously into being. And if we speak of an original revelation of God to man or in man or humanity, the meaning will always be just this, that along with the absolute dependence which characterizes not only man or humanity, but all temporal existence, there is given to humanity also the immediate self-consciousness of it, which becomes a consciousness of God. Right? So everything is absolutely dependent on God. Human beings become conscious of this, and they become conscious of it being God when the idea of God arises with it. He doesn't ever say where that comes from, but notice this isn't being taught to you. It's the idea of God arises in conjunction with this consciousness, and then it becomes a clear self-consciousness when that idea arises. But the word God is simply describing your immediate consciousness of absolute dependence. Right, so if you ask, what does the word God mean for Schleiermacher? It means that upon which I'm immediately conscious of being absolutely dependent. Okay, that's it. And whether you can say more about God is another question, right? Now what happens though then, so that if that were the only thing going on, then everyone would have the same religious life, right? Everyone would have this immediate consciousness of God, and there wouldn't be anything distinctive about anything. Everyone would just have this immediate consciousness of God. He's often read this way, but this is absolutely not what he's talking about. Because as I mentioned before, this immediate self-consciousness cannot arise in our consciousness on its own. It's always there, but it can't be known unless it combines with our daily experience. Right? And that's when it gets interesting. Because when the immediate self-consciousness of absolute dependence combines with my experience of sitting in this room with you all, it gives rise to what he calls religious emotions. And they're religious emotions because they're distinct from the emotions that arise from my experience of the world, that relative dependence and relative freedom. For instance, when Jesus is crucified, there's a long tradition, in the Catholic tradition in particular, that he experiences the beatific vision as he's crying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Right? How is it possible for Jesus to experience blessedness at the same time he's being crucified? Schleiermacher would say that shows you the difference between religious emotions and temporal emotions, right? Or you can experience religious anguish in the midst of a wedding ceremony, right? Because your consciousness of God is not combining with your consciousness of that wedding ceremony. And therefore there's a depression in one part of your life, even as there's elation in another. So he would point out that religious emotions are distinct because they're not determined by the circumstances of our life. This is where I wish the church would get a clue and quit making its religious holidays theater. How can we celebrate Easter when there's a pandemic going on? That is just, how can we think this way? Easter has nothing to do with your mood. Easter has nothing to do with a sunny day and spring flowers, right? Easter has to do with the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. So this wouldn't be Schleiermacher. He doesn't believe in the resurrection from the dead, but he's trying to point out that religious emotions are not determined by the temporal circumstances in which we find ourselves. And remember that story about the Moravian children singing on the boat that Wesley saw. So for Schleiermacher, religious emotions are very distinct from our ordinary emotions, and we need to keep that in mind. They can also go together. You could have religious emotions of blessedness at the same time that you have temporal emotions of blessedness. For instance, let's say the wedding's going well, right? So, but they are distinct. This is his point. So religious emotions are distinct from our temporal emotions, but they only arise when the consciousness of God combines with our consciousness of the world. Have you ever had that experience, by the way, where there was a rock at Colgate University where I went to my undergraduate life, and there was a place called Chapel House that you'd walk to up this road above campus. And when you walk by up this road above campus, there was an erratic rock, huge erratic rock, and there weren't a lot of erratic rocks in, a glacier dropped it in Hamilton, New York. So there's this huge rock surrounded by a couple of trees. And I would walk by that rock, and I was conscious that there was something there that wasn't anything in the world, right? That would be an instance of consciousness of God combining with a consciousness of my environment, right? And I had the sense that there was something there. There was something objectively there that wasn't there before. Well, Schleiermacher would say, don't project it. That's your God consciousness combining with your consciousness of this rock. And if that happened enough and in a perpetual way, I could actually start a religious community around that rock. Because when people would come into conjunction with that rock, they would experience the same thing, and they would claim that's a divine manifestation there, right? Well, it's not actually a divine manifestation there, it's your consciousness of God combining with your consciousness of that rock. I mean, I still remember what that felt like. It happened every time I walked by that rock. It was really kind of uncanny, right? So that for Schleiermacher would be how religious emotions come to arise, is that you become conscious of your immediate consciousness of absolute dependence at the same time you're conscious of something in the world, right? And if that happens enough, with enough different people, you actually get a religious tradition starting, right? And they can be as small as a clan and as large as the globe. Right, but they all have for him the same dynamic. Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question is, what about atheism? What are atheists doing? And Schleiermacher would say, I mean, the atheists were definitely around in his day. They're not as around as we might think. There have always been a very small percentage, at least in the United States, but still, it's a really good question. So what's an atheist doing? An atheist is probably denying a reality out there, right, who's the cause of all sorts of mischief. If you read the contemporary atheists in particular, they go after evil, right, the experience of evil in the world. And so if there is a God, God is causing all this mischief, like COVID, like the invasion of Ukraine, all this stuff. And so God's a total bumbler, and how can you believe in an entity like that? Well, that's talking about a God who's out there, who does things directly in the world, and who has control over what's happening in the world. That is not Schleiermacher's God. So Schleiermacher, let's say they're denying something that doesn't exist, right? They're thinking about God as an entity, as an agent out there who's doing these acts. That's not Schleiermacher. God is that upon which the universe is absolutely dependent.
They have formed a concept.
Right.
to worship.
They form the concept to deny, right? Right. And so, I mean, I think that would be his rejoinder. But it would also show, and I think this is a really important question, that this development of the religious consciousness in religious communities is not inevitable, right? So it is a matter of human development, and it can misfire, right? And so that would be another thing that would may be happening is that their God consciousness has not, in fact, ever combined with their consciousness of the world sufficient to actually lead them to join a community of piety. And that would be an indictment then of the communities of piety, and he was very critical of the churches of his day. By the way, he was ordained a Reformed pastor and preached for the rest of his life. So I think it's important to keep in mind that he was a churchman there. But he was very critical, the way the Moravians were actually, that the communication of piety in the churches could be so cold that it would actually not only not awaken the feeling of absolute dependence in combination with what's going on in church, it could actually suppress it and could actually alienate people. So that's a really good question. So on one hand, you'd say they're either denying something that he's not talking about, or they're ignoring aspects of their own experience, or you could say it's the fault of religious communities not awakening this immediate consciousness of absolute dependence in them. And that then becomes a major project for him is in rightly describing the way religious emotions arise. You then make much more effective use of the means of communication in religious communities to focus on what really matters and ignore or downplay the things that don't. So arguing about doctrine, does an argument about doctrine really enhance your consciousness of God in that moment when you're walking by the rock or when you're sitting and saying, no. I mean, it actually alienates you, right, I think. And so you would say, yes, doctrine's important, but doctrine is describing religious emotions. Doctrine is describing what makes Christian religious emotions Christian, or Jewish religious emotions Jewish. It's not talking about reality out there. He thinks that if we say we have no explanation, that's the God of the gaps again, and then you're dead in the water. So then you're just a sitting duck for scientific criticism, he would say. Now, I'm not saying that this is what I would say or what anyone else would say, but he would say if you simply refuse to answer the question, somebody else is going to answer it for you, right? You can't, as a theologian who is helping to direct the church during a very tumultuous time, I mean, we're talking about the age of Napoleon here, we're talking about the era of, pretty soon, of Feuerbach and Nietzsche are going to come along, so it's a very critical era. And so if you don't answer the question, somebody else is going to answer it for you. Or they're going to say, you don't know what you're talking about. So for him, he wanted to show that religious life is necessary to what it means to be human. So if you're not religious in some way, you're less than human. I think that's a really interesting claim, right? Because a lot of people would say if you're religious, you're less than human, right? So if you're not religious, you're less than human. It's an essential aspect of human development. So why is it an essential aspect of human development? Well, he would say it can't be an essential aspect of human development vis-a-vis duty, because then everyone has the same duty, that would be Kant. It can't be a necessary development in terms of thinking, because then it's all philosophy and Hegel. So it has to be, in his experience, what got him through the experience of criticism was emotion. Right, was the emotional valence of Christianity and of religion. And so that's it. If you put something through the acid bath and it comes out the other side, that's the reality, right? And so that's why he would say it's not knowing or doing, but feeling, because that feeling never went away, in spite of all of the criticism. So then the question is, what is that feeling? And the feeling is the combination of the immediate intuition of absolute dependence with my experience in the world, right? And when that happens, that's an experience of joy. And when that doesn't happen, that's an experience of sorrow, right? Or even of sin. But so it would be, for him, that's just he's trying to describe what really is at the heart of religious tradition. He's not positing it, he's trying to describe it as best he can understand it. So for him, religious traditions are living things, right? And they need to respond creatively to the moment in which they find themselves. And this is his way actually of doing that, because to root Christianity in the universal religious life of humanity was a very challenging thing, right? Oh yes, Karen's calling it. So being creative also means observing the time limits here, but no, Patsy, you're absolutely right that for him, part of this free scientific inquiry and living faith means that there's this constant dynamic